Going to get this going. So I'm at Dunwoody. This is Nick Carr. We're both consultants at Mandiant, focusing on incident response. So this talk really comes from a particular investigation that we did, in the last year or so. That was particularly demanding. And so we're going to talk about some of the challenges that kind of came from that, some of the approaches that we took to address those challenges, and some of the lessons that we learned along the way. So right off the top, a couple disclaimers. First off, the confidentiality of our clients is paramount, so we've done what we needed to do to maintain that confidentiality. And secondly, we're incident response consultants. We're not researchers or particularly experts in any of these domains. We really focus on knowing enough about a lot of different tech to kind of get the job done. So there certainly could be people here that know more about some of these specific things than we do, but we focus on getting it done. Cool. All right. So a little background here. Started the way a lot of these things do with a phishing email, fairly generic looking. I think it was designed to actually look like kind of commoditized, nonsense phishing. The client investigated but failed their first remediation because they hadn't fully scoped. So then the very determined nation-state attacker that was in this environment decided that they weren't getting kicked out and really started to kind of drive on more aggressively, kind of went rampage. Their attacker's mission really wasn't impacted by any of these ongoing remediation measures that the attacker was doing, that the client was doing when we arrived on site. The two attacker real objectives here were to steal the email of targeted VIPs and to monitor the security team in order to keep an eye on what was being done from a response perspective. So kind of the long-term outcome of this, we had a 4-person team on site. The two of us, DJ, and one or two more people would kind of bounce on and off. We were there for about 8 months all told, one of the longer investigations we've really been involved in. At the end, we had over 1,000 compromised systems, similar number of unique malware samples, as well as unique C2 domains and IPs. 50,000 plus email communications stolen that we identified, but there were probably a lot more that we didn't have evidence of, including all their scripts and tools and config files and everything. I went through our sandbox, and there were over 7,000 files in there that were tagged for this specific investigation. So how did they pull this off? It was really through just the fast pace of their intrusion, the very stealthy tactics that they used, the rapidly changing tactics, as well as some of these never-before-seen advanced techniques, things that we knew about, had seen research on, but either hadn't encountered in the wild or hadn't seen used to the extent that this attacker used them. So those are the 4 things we're really going to be talking about here. And the first of these challenges that we're going to address is the pace of the attacker activity. So after that first failed remediation attempt, the attacker started infecting 10 or more systems per day with their main backdoor family. Especially when they were provoked, the client insisted on pulling systems offline, just kind of an internal political thing that we really couldn't get them to stop doing. So they kept pulling them, and then the attacker would just infect that many more systems, making sure that they always had access to continue their mission no matter what was going on in the environment. They accessed hundreds of systems for recon and credential theft. They removed tools and forensic artifacts to hide the activity, which really forced us to move a lot faster to get to these systems before they could remove a lot of these things. They deployed additional backdoor families. So even as they were deploying 10 backdoors per day of their main family, they were deploying kind of these stealthy one-offs or these secondary families that were really designed to maintain that deeper level of persistence. And they continued to steal data every week. No matter what the client did, they never interrupted their data theft efforts. So what did we do to try to respond to this? Well, the first thing we had to change was the way that we do our live response analysis. Typically, anytime we have a compromised system, we do a fairly deep dive forensic analysis of that system in order to determine exactly what's happened on it, what the attacker's been doing. But with the sheer number of systems, and with so many of them being very similar in the activity that we identified on them, there really just wasn't enough time to get through that level of analysis on all these systems. So we were able to compress that down into an abbreviated triage analysis, which really leveraged the attacker's tools, techniques, and procedures, the activity that we knew them to be engaged in, to help us to compress that time frame. So to do this, we developed signatures for all of their activity, meaning not just their malware, but also their lateral movement techniques, their secondary tools, any kind of forensic artifacts left behind by things that they were doing, even some of their cleanup measures, so that by the time you got to a system, you would have a good idea of what had happened on there before you even arrived at it. So then you still have to look at all of these systems. You're looking for the lateral movement. We weren't able to create a lot of good signatures for that, so you really had to still get on there, make sure that you knew where the attacker was coming from, what accounts were in use, all those sorts of key elements. Pivoting, recon, new tools or backdoors, really anything that we hadn't seen before, any deviation was really critical to identify because that's how we're going to know, what they're coming out with next, what new backdoor family is dropping, and take those indicators back to look at scale. And any sign of data theft, because that's obviously critical to the client to know exactly what's leaving the environment. The next thing we did was streamline the documentation. As much as we typically do a very deep level forensic analysis, we also have a similar level of documentation that we provide to the client. Unfortunately, in this instance, that really wasn't possible as those reports take time to generate and to write. So in this instance, we were able to compress this down into these standardized finding blocks, which the client was comfortable with. These really focused on kind of key aspects off each system, malware and attacker tools that we identified on the system, the persistence mechanism used to ensure that the malware ran across reboots, periods of attacker activity and any significant timestamps, as well as the source of the activity on that system so that we could make sure that we had good coverage across and could kind of trace the advance of the attack. We also documented anything else that didn't fit into that block, new TTPs, data theft, anything like that after this. And this all just went into our engagement tracking spreadsheet which we shared with the client so they were able to keep an eye on how things were going. The next real step was to leverage the available resources within the organization. So generally when we go in and do one of these investigations, we really go in, we do all the analysis ourselves. In this particular instance, just because we weren't allowed to bring enough consultants on site to do all of the analysis that was in front of us, we were able to leverage some of the client personnel to do some things that we generally wouldn't have them do, including assisting with network monitoring, including analysts as well as network sensors. And also to do that triage analysis, which I mentioned. So we walked them through our process of doing this triage analysis, and they would go through and help us get through these systems. And anytime that we identified anything that really was different or interesting, we would kind of follow back on those systems and make sure that we were getting a thorough analysis of them. We also worked with the SCCM team to help find some of the low-hanging fruit of things that the attacker was doing. Anytime that they did start to get into a repetitive pattern where we could use SCCM to look for it, we would, because it helped to ensure that we had maximal coverage over the environment, and it was just another resource to help speed up the rate at which we were identifying these systems. We also worked with the HIPS team to create some host intrusion prevention rules on the endpoints to help with the remediation. We never really expected this to actually stop the attacker. The hope was that if they did come back and use a lot of the TTPs we'd seen before, that it would at least set off some alerts and maybe slow them down a little bit so that we could mount a meaningful defense against them. So kind of the lesson of this whole piece is to be willing to change the normal practices and disregard official methodologies when they're not working. You have to be fast and flexible. You have to do what you need to do to get the job done. And if the way that you've been doing it before, the way you're supposed to do it, gets in the way, you have to be willing to disregard that. And to make the most of outside help. Every team is always going to have some constrictions. You're never going to have the exact right people that you want or all the logistical support that you might want. So be willing to reach outside of your normal team and your normal processes and see what's out there that can really help you get the job done, especially when you're doing something to this scale. So I'll hand it off to Nick.
Thanks, Matt. And to people that are standing in the back, there's actually a lot of seats over in the front if you want. It's way better with the slides, so it doesn't bother me. So the next big challenge was just how stealthy the attacker was. They were using a number of counter-forensic techniques on the endpoints and on the network. So on the host, they were using things like secure deletion. They had really impressive operational security. So they would, I think we said they packed up and moved. So they would, every 2 to 3 days, they would just delete their tools and move systems regardless if we have found them or not. And then they followed this 90% doctrine. That's just what we came up with again to call this, where of those 10 systems they had infected with a particular backdoor family, they'd share 9 characteristics and then a 10th would be really different. Really smart idea. That way they could test out some new tactics on that 10th system or also identify how it was they were being found. On the network side, they used exclusively, so all those 1,000-plus network indicators, they used exclusively compromised third-party websites. And they also used social media as C2. So either legitimate websites like social media sites that they were using maliciously or legitimate third-party websites out there that they had compromised for infrastructure. They altered their communication scheme regularly. They had really strong cryptographic implementations, and they also embraced SSL. So they kind of did it all. The odds, magnifying it, the odds were really stacked against us. We were unable to use our Mandiant network sensors and some of the signatures we had coming into it. And some of the existing devices were inconsistently deployed and had some spotty coverage. So Also, the rolling remediation, which is kind of, we actually see that a lot. We sometimes call it whack-a-mole. That approach, in this particular case, was really showing our hand to the attacker. So again, they knew exactly what was working, what wasn't. So the first thing we did on the endpoints is we made the most out of some of these trace artifacts. So although the attacker was using sdelete, right, the file, paths, and names, and the content was certainly not recoverable, but we did some other things on the metadata to help identify activity. So regular expressions to identify the particular pattern left, right, when you run Microsoft's, the sysinternals sdelete tool. And then for those entries, the entry modified timestamp would typically indicate when that sdelete occurred. So now you have a little bit more information. Some of these we've actually been doing for a while, but they're a good illustration. So anytime you run sdelete, or actually any of the sysinternals tools, it leaves, you have to accept the end user license agreement. So if you do it interactively or on the command line, you still have to do it. That leaves a nice little registry entry for each tool. So then, okay, now we start to have something where we can identify new uses of sdelete across the environment. Then, now we said the file names were overwritten. That's true by that pattern, but there's other places you could actually identify the original file names. For instance, when the attacker was running certain things, compressing files, for instance, if there was prefetch on that system before the attacker started deleting the prefetch files, they, the access files there would give you an original file name. So, on the network side, we made lemonade out of the network lemons, right? So we leveraged these client network tools, and we embraced the varying tech, and it actually turned out to be a really interesting, really good thing here. It turns out that the attacker would do the same thing, and when it traversed different appliances, you'd get different results. So normally you don't expect to get different results when the attacker's doing the same thing. We looked for patterns there. So we began to take the time and patience to sort through that noise. So for every newly discovered compromised system, we'd look on the network side for all the activity during that period of compromise. And then we would, and we did this kind of blindly in a SIM. We didn't really know what devices were out there, just that there was a bunch of different devices within different business units of the company. So then we searched for all the activity between sets of infected hosts. So of those 10 per day, we kind of did more analysis between those and looked for anything. There was tons of stuff firing. So, and anytime we found valuable filters to reduce the information down, we automated that and developed dashboards so that the incident response team could focus on more interesting things as opposed to repeating and repeating. So what did that look like? Here's two kind of examples. This particular device that the attacker's behavior was, or the traffic was traversing over, was an untuned device, only captured the first packet. It analyzed all of it, but you could only really do, you could only pull the first packet for validation. So one of the things the attacker was doing, let me give you the first example. One of the things the attacker was doing was using SMB to push files around the network. Very common, and they were using UPX packing, commercial packing, to push their files around. So this security appliance actually had a signature for the SMB transfer of UPX files. So anyone that defends your network, like, that's a super noisy signature, and it was firing, everywhere. That's very valid for admins to be doing it. But then we start to extract the fields that are most interesting to us. So in this case, in the example here, we recreated, right, we have the file name, and we used Splunk. It was really great to pull out and create new objects to create indexes off of. So in this case, you see, you can start to separate out, these are UPX packed files that an attacker pushed, and the first one is a printer software. So printer software is pretty commonly packed. That would not be that interesting. And then seeing an attacker push over SMB, push Adobe ARM.exe and BCS sync.exe, UPX packed files to those locations. That's a little bit suspicious. Okay, so that stuff was pretty good. Then we started to combine signatures. So the second example requires a little bit of a quick story. So as we're chasing these guys around, we found a couple systems. We'd look at it, and they got on it, and they ran a batch script. They ran a scheduled task to execute a batch script. There wasn't really anything else there. By the time we got there, they had securely deleted the batch script, and there was nothing. So we timelined it. We looked for anything on the system, anytime we're trying to find any other leads. And there wasn't that much we could identify. So we lowered the prioritization there and said, we'll come back and look at this a little bit later. So enter the network side as we start to combine signatures and look between these compromised hosts. We see a kind of interesting thing firing on an untuned device, this MSRPC suspicious encryption event. So it turns out when you use the newer task scheduler, it encrypts the scheduled task when you do the remote scheduled task using the Schedule Tasks tool, as opposed to a lot of us see the attackers run to run unnamed scheduled tasks. So that it used an encrypted packet. This was firing on this and every suspicious RPC package. So we would filter that down. It turns out we were able to identify the UUID associated with scheduled tasks. And so this was neat. All of a sudden, we had some visibility to the attacker scheduling tasks on the network side. Well, then we'd go back and we look between two systems that we knew the attacker was on, and there was something else firing right at the same time, and that was SMB writes to System 32. So that's super noisy as a signature, but when combined with this other, it was really interesting. It turns out what the attacker was doing is they were pushing their files to SMB. They were actually overwriting, which double time stomping legitimate Microsoft binaries in System 32. Then they were dropping a batch script, running it with the scheduled task tool, and they were taking ownership. And so from our perspective, when we responded to it, that's why we couldn't see any of the timestamp activity lining up. So the key for us here was that network time is preserved when the other timestamps couldn't be trusted. That was actually a way we identified a different backdoor family. All right, so in addition to making the best of what we had, we made some new stuff. So we deployed additional budget-friendly open source tech. In this case, Bro IDS. If people aren't using it, I really recommend it. A lot of us like it. Then we found ways to apply our methodology to it. So we have an incident tracker we use. We track all the details of the investigation. We found ways to implement that on the back end to enrich that data. And then we did things like a classic Mandiant approach is stacking, frequency analysis. That's just fancy speak for counting things. So we just counted stuff. But the coolest part about using things like Splunk and I think Excel and just some other tools, more people are adopting spark lines recently. They allow you to show another element. In this case, we chose time. So if you look at what actually happened here, this was towards the end of the investigation with a high-fidelity network signature that's actually firing every time the attacker interacts with the system. So walking up there from host 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 10, the attacker is dropping a backdoor there, right, in that order. And the first one is just beaconing out immediately as soon as it's installed. Then, so from our perspective, typically, when we're running endpoint sweeps and we identify attacker activity, we're most interested in the most recent activity. So host 10, if you knew nothing else, was that's when the most recent backdoor was installed. We're going to look at that first. So with this visibility, you see, oh, wait, the attacker actually dropped backdoors on 10 systems, then they went back to the 5th system, and they were active on that system. And they would obviously change which one that was. So very difficult, very stealthy, but we started to catch up. And then we were able to prioritize host analysis based on the traffic. Then lastly, the great part here was host 5, you got the smash and grab. Before they could delete their files, that's where we jumped on and grabbed everything out of the directories we knew they were working in. So that's where we started to catch up on their tools as well. The lesson learned for us here is to add visibility, never stop looking. So map what the attacker is doing to all the sources of evidence you have and make sure you minimize your blind spots. So that included here giving your teams access to different tools they might not be used to. So people doing host space analysis, giving access to the network side and vice versa. Consider deploying additional technology. Use that cautiously, but if the situation warrants it, it can be great to augment in areas that you're weak. And then network time just provided that reliable reconstruction of events when other things couldn't. You can't really stomp network time, right? And then combat IR fatigue by automating your high-confidence searches. Once the attacker's found, fight to maintain line of sight. That's a good transition into the third challenge. That's just how rapidly the tactics were evolving, right? So there were 7 distinct backdoor families. One malware family went through at least 3 major version revisions. I'll show you that in a second. The attacker was also using 7 unique persistence mechanisms, so 7 different ways to persist reboot. And they would just cycle these intermittently among their different malware families, but they were registry run keys, shortcut persistence, installing the malware as a persistent service, using WMI, which Matt's going to talk about in a minute, using name scheduled task, hijacking pre-existing name scheduled tasks to really blend in. That was pretty tricky. And then overwriting the legitimate files. I gave you a few examples of those on the network side, but really if you think about it, it was really pretty smart. anything that already has pre-existing persistence. In this case, I think Adobe ARM and BCS Sync and files like that are just run key persistence, but then the registry timestamp is super old for those, and they're not creating new entries. So they overwrote them, and they used icons, PE resources, things that blended in. So it actually made it pretty hard to find. Then also, people in InfoSec will share things like MD5s, file names, and command and control, and call these indicators. In some cases, that's valid. In this case, they were unique to every system, so that's not much of an indicator. You're not going to really re-find it, and certainly not worth hashing everything on disk and looking for something that's not going to be used again. So the attacker also didn't need to reuse compromised accounts. Again, think about that for a second. One of the things we always track is they're probably using these sets of admin credentials that they're moving around. They didn't have to reuse them. Matt's going to talk about exactly why that was. All right. So I apologize, especially to people over on that side and that are a little further back, but I wanted to give a quick example of what it really looked like about trying to keep our eyes on the malware families as they shifted. So I mentioned I was going to show you 3 version updates that this went through. So all credit to the attacker here. This was really impressive. This is reducing it down a good amount. But version 1, this is actually just the cookie field of one of their backdoor families, but it used a static cookie name. It was encoded with base64, compressed, then used AES. It used good crypto implementations. Again, they were hard-coded into each unique malware sample, so you'd have to actually recover it on disk, and then you could decode it. But we could decode it, certainly had a signature for it, and we could see it across a bunch of devices. Enter version 2. So we lost our ability to decode it. They dynamically changed the cookie names. They used a custom base64 library dictionary. Okay, fine. But within there, they actually implemented an RC4 cipher, and they were using this stream cipher per session, so they generated per session RC4 keys. So we'd essentially have to brute force it on our end after we've already recovered the AES key and the initialization vector. So we lost our ability to decode it meaningfully. That wasn't worth our time. Version 3, at least at that point we had a signature for it. So version 3, they just did things like they implemented a random split function. Anyone that writes snort sigs is like, okay, there's a little bit more noise that's going to enter there just because the ability to write something that at scale for actual random functions, it's very frustrating, even with a bunch of regexes. Then at least we could still see it. Well, that changed. They wrapped it in SSL, so we lost our ability to see it. Now, that was just for a little bit because we got frustrated. We turned around and we looked, okay, good, we have Bro, so we get some of this cool data. So Bro does some really cool stuff in the SSL log. You get a bunch of data from the SSL session, even if you don't know what's going on inside. You can look at that metadata. The X509 certificate, you can see the certificate email associated with it, the actual cipher, and then the big thing here that's not on there is we're actually able to, it automatically identifies self-signed certificates. So what you're kind of looking at here is a recreation, again, of a bunch of SSL signed certificates. Then within there, you can filter down on, the attacker wasn't being thorough maybe and just left the default email addresses for those, and then using the exact same AES 256 cipher that we knew the backdoor to use. So you start to catch up, and at least there we could see it again. We added this last note at the end that they intermittently did and didn't use SSL, which was actually even more frustrating because then you lost what was changing underneath. So it was very difficult to keep up with. So we touched on this a little bit. We had to prioritize systems with unknown activity. The most interesting systems were always the one where we knew the attacker accessed it, but we didn't know what they did. This was that one-off stealthy activity. So we limited analysis on systems with known and consistent attacker tactics. There's no way to say I write indicators for unknown activity, right? What we did is we really automated as much as possible looking for known activity, and then everything else was the stuff we'd focus on. So while those things weren't useful as standalone indicators, the MD5s, file names, the command and control specifically, it turned out to be very necessary to track and prioritize. Because they were compromising these third-party websites for use as C2, some of them start to share traits. An example I'd give you is a particular application that blood donor websites were using, right? So to give you an idea of how much we're making it up as we go along to stay on these guys, we broadened a bunch of our network SIGs when we couldn't find them, and then we searched for blood in the fully qualified domain name. And we found 2 more C2 channels. So it worked. You do what you got to do. But some other things, some more practical things, there's a pseudo-random file name that's dropped associated with each C2 channel. So as soon as we'd see that from an endpoint sweep, we knew that we already knew the C2 for it. Maybe we didn't have to recover the binary immediately. We can prioritize that one lower. We still looked at every system, but we found little ways to speed up. And then the last thing I want to talk about is we continually improved our host-based indicators. So Matt mentioned we had indicators for every stage of the life cycle. So all 7 persistence mechanisms we talked about, we had things for the attacker using those in the particular way. The reconnaissance, lateral movement, and data theft. These are methodology indicators. It's kind of core to what we do on our team at Mandiant, or behavioral indicators, if you want to call them that. So that way we know what the attacker is doing, and regardless of the backdoor family they're using. Then the Flare team, our malware analysts, did a deep dive and did a full malware analysis of every backdoor revision and updated the indicators as needed. And we maintained a list of high confidence indicators to focus new development. This was just to try to maintain the craziness. As the 4 of us are going back and forth coming up with new ways to do things, we needed to focus in. But there's a little crazy story that came out of it. So I had a list of the 7 different ways we were finding one backdoor family. We felt pretty good about it, and then 1 week later, the attacker had changed 6 of those. So we were only finding them with 1 way. So kind of validated our approach, and also made us think a little bit more about them targeting the incident response team and everything like that. So it was important to maintain and know where you need to develop indicators. And lastly, developing these flexible and resilient indicators, focusing on writing them to get high fidelity matches on how to pick up on any changes the attacker might be doing. So using things like imports and exports, size ranges, section names, compile times, other consistent attributes, you could actually write indicators for attacker packaging of tools. So anyone that's done incident response, forensic stuff, malware analysis, instantly you recognize this is a picture of malware. No, this is just how we try to categorize a bunch of their different utilities and malware families. They'd use this layered approach. So at its core, they used a scripting language, in this case, obfuscated Python. Great idea, cross-platform, easy to quickly update and change. Then they'd wrap it with a compiler, PyInstaller or Py.exe, UPX packet, as we mentioned before, and then push it over SMB to other systems. So for each layer there, right, we sped up as much as possible, had indicators to do enterprise-wide string searches of process memory to find the deobfuscated backdoor. But the core of our work was really in that middle area. It turns out when you use PyInstaller and Py.exe, you get a certain set of import hashes and a certain set of compile times. And then when combined with using UPX packing in kind of the default mode, your section names, UPX0, UPX1, UPX2, stuff like that, you start to have indicators for this packaging regardless of what's changed underneath. Then we adapted those that file system-based indicator to look all the other places where we'd seen it, so process handles and in prefetch and in event logs and stuff like that. And the last one, we also had some SIGs that found their encrypted backdoors before they pushed them out to new systems. So the real lesson with if the attacker's rapidly evolving their tactics is to find it once, kind of refine it, and re-find it again and continually work on it. This was a change of mindset for us, to enhance your best indicators. When you felt really good about something, it was kind of time to consider maybe improving that even more. These were all like low to no false positive indicators as well, so it's just continually refining your best ones. Track what the attacker can change before you lose visibility of their activity, because they might. And then don't let that technical data fall through the cracks. Even if it's not particularly valuable seeming as an indicator, it's really important. It will be important for reporting to pull this whole thing together, but it's important for shaping the direction of the investigation and prioritizing systems. So with that, back to Matt.
Great. So the last challenge we're going to talk about is some of these advanced attack techniques that they were using. So they were using Windows management instrumentation. So this is a administrative framework that underlies Windows. It started back in like Windows 95. I mean, it's been around forever, but it seems like all of a sudden people have really started to take more of an interest in it. So they used WMI to persist backdoors, to embed backdoor files and PowerShell scripts in the WMI repository, which is basically a file on disk that stores all of this WMI data. So it allowed them to store these files in a fileless way, where if you're just doing standard file system forensics, you won't be able to identify it. They used it to steal credentials from remote systems, so instead of having to use like PSExec or schedule task or something like that, they were able to use this for their remote code execution. They also configured a backdoor to extract and execute months into the future. The idea being that if we did remediate and successfully remove them from the environment, if we overlooked this very hidden WMI backdoor, a few months later it would pop this backdoor out, it would connect out, and they'd be right back in again. They also leverage PowerShell, another very powerful administrative tool used extensively in any modern Windows domain. It really provides a very powerful but stealthy mechanism for attack, especially in Windows 7 with the PowerShell 2.0 that comes installed there by default. The logging just doesn't give you very much. So they use this to execute some of their stealthy backdoors. They used it, some of the PowerShell scripts like invoke Mimikatz to evade antivirus detection. It also has excellent WMI integration, so they use this to actually implement a lot of the WMI attacks. And really, they use PowerShell in every stage of their attack lifecycle. It was really kind of what their attacks were built around. And then Kerberos, the Kerberos authentication protocol is what's used for authentication in any modern Windows domain. So they used a lot of these ticket attacks. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with them. They've gotten a lot of press, but this is one of the first times we'd ever seen them used in the wild, and they used them pervasively. This really made tracking a lot of their lateral movement more difficult and was a very powerful tool for them. So first we'll talk about this WMI usage. So the first thing we really tackled here was their use of WMI persistence. So this was one of the first times we'd ever encountered this, and it was difficult at first to look at it at scale. So we basically started out looking on a given endpoint, looking at the strings from the objects.data file, which is part of that WMI repository, which stores all this data. So you'd actually just pull the strings out of it and look through it for the relevant strings for this WMI persistence. That's not scaling at all, and that's very time consuming. So eventually we were able to run some scripts across the environment to parse out this persistence. WMI is an administrative framework, so there are ways to query this at scale. Basically what we worked with the client was that they ran this script and it kind of dumped into a file share and we would grep against it. Here again, kind of kludgy, not very effective. So eventually some of our colleagues developed a custom mirror audit to allow us to look for this persistence at scale very quickly. This turned out to be very valuable, mirror being our primary tool that we use for any of these investigations. We also found ways to identify the attacker code in the WMI repository. So the attacker was using embedded PowerShell code in WMI class properties to execute code on remote systems. So basically the way this works is you can use WMI commands to create a class on a remote system. Basically this gives you something to write into on the remote system in the repository. You can add properties to that, so they created 2 text properties. They would write the contents of the invoke Mimikatz script into one of these properties, send a process call create command, which in WMI will create a process. With that, they sent a PowerShell stub, which would execute the contents of that first class property, dump the credentials into the second property, read the contents of that credential from the remote system back to their system, and then delete that class, which would basically wipe all the evidence that this ever happened out. And really all you get then on the remote system from a forensic standpoint is the initial logon event. So sometimes the attacker wouldn't delete the class, or the way that they implemented their script would sometimes fail. So we were able to focus on some of the class and property names that they were using and look for that in the objects.data strings and could do that at scale. We also looked if they were actually embedding plain text code. We were also able to identify that. We also had to find ways to parse out some of these embedded scripts and malware. The WMI repository where all this stuff was getting stored is not the easiest thing to work with. It is not really documented anywhere. And it will actually break up the things that are embedded in it after a certain size. It starts chopping it up, putting it all across this file. All this is associated based on some external files that basically index all of this stuff. At the time, we didn't have any kind of parser for it, so this was basically a very manual process of parsing out the contents of this file and trying to piece all of this back together. This worked pretty well when they were doing this with plain text code or with binaries, but the challenge really came when they started doing this with adding a layer of encryption on top of it. So they would actually create a persistent PowerShell stub, which would extract decrypt and execute this backdoor on the system in memory. Very stealthy, but also kind of a pain, because if you're trying to parse this out, if you don't get all of the pieces, don't get them into the exact right order, it won't decrypt. So we had some luck doing this, just manually piecing this stuff together. I think there's one file that I haven't been able to get yet, but I'm going to get it. Thankfully, partway through the investigation, we actually did start to get some parsers coming in. So Willie, Matt, and Claudio were very helpful in developing some new tools for this, as well as actually reversing the entire WMI repository. So now Willie actually has out on his public GitHub a full parser for the WMI repository. So if you run into this in the future, install his handy Python modules, and then you'll actually be able to parse out all of those files and anything else that you want out of that repository, which there's some good forensic data in there as well. So this is an example of what that persistence would look like when we were parsing it out of the strings. So at the top you have the event filter. This actually determines when the persistence will execute. In this instance, it will run on certain days of the week at a predetermined time, basically using what looks like a SQL query. Then you have at the bottom the command line event consumer. This would represent an instance where they're actually using one of these PowerShell stubs to extract and decrypt and execute an embedded backdoor. And then you have the filter to consumer binding, which basically just pairs the two things up. So the next thing we'll talk about is PowerShell. So PowerShell 2.0, which ships with Windows 7 Server 2008, really doesn't have any effective logging in it. There's enough there to know that PowerShell executed, but really no idea of what actually happened on the endpoint. Thankfully, they've been doing a lot to improve that. PowerShell 4.0 has some improvements in it, especially for Windows 8.1 Plus, but in this instance, it was mostly Windows 7. But we were able to enable module logging. Look for PowerShell 5 to come out. There's a lot better logging in it. But we were able to get this deployed across the environment, and this basically recorded a lot of the attacker activity, including input and output, variable initialization, entire functions out of the PowerShell scripts that they were executing, some of the attacker commands, script output. So this really allowed us to see at scale what the attacker was doing. It was all but a transcript of what actual commands they were running, what the content of their scripts was. This really enabled us to get a kind of unprecedented visibility into what they were doing, given that they were using this otherwise very stealthy tool. Along with that, we were able to write indicators to actually observe this activity at scale. So we were able to capture lateral movement, unique backdoors, credential theft, data theft, reconnaissance, persistence creation, really every aspect of their attacks used PowerShell. So in this recording, we were really able to write very effective indicators to not only observe what they were doing, but also to find their activity at scale. A great example of how valuable this was in their data theft. They were using a PowerShell script along with a legitimate Microsoft Exchange DLL to actually dump the email from Exchange servers onto whatever local system they happened to be on. And when they would do that, the script would write these files out to the file system, like these EML files, and the logs would actually record the name of all of these files, which also corresponded to the names of the emails they were stealing. We would also get the name of the account that they were taking emails from, as well as the name of the admin account they were using to dump them. So we basically got full visibility into all of their data theft once we were able to get this logging out there, and could just then hand that over to the client. So really kind of the point of this is that we're able to turn PowerShell from a threat to a benefit. It went from being a very stealthy, very powerful tool into something that really allowed us to identify their activity at scale and really know exactly what they were doing. And I really don't think that we would have been successful in remediating this if we hadn't been able to get this logging deployed in their environment. So this is a great example of what you'll see in these PowerShell logs, specifically the module logging. So you see at the top there's a lot of different metadata. Included in that is the command path, in this case cwindows temp diag3.ps1. That actually turned out to be the invoke mimikatz script. So then you see down there, you can actually see the output from mimikatz, the header. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. And then below that, you can actually see the exact command that was being run, which is the Kerberos pass the ticket attack with 1.krb, which would be one of their forged Kerberos tickets. And you see the characteristic mimikatz buy down there at the end. So that kind of brings us to our next thing, which is the Kerberos ticket attacks. So Kerberos provided them a lot of capability in doing their ticket attacks. So first off, it allowed them to use arbitrary account names and privilege levels for their logons. So You can really specify basically any account name you want. In this case, what the attacker did was to enumerate all of the unprivileged accounts in Active Directory and then kind of randomly pick accounts out and then use that account name to authenticate to the remote system, giving themselves administrator privileges on it. Made it a lot harder to identify at scale, given that on every system they would be using a different account, and especially in an environment as large as this with, I'm not even sure how many users, over 100,000. It was very difficult to try to nail that down compared to, looking for administrator accounts where maybe, they have, even if they have 100 or a few hundred, it's manageable. This also had the benefit of not providing the typical explicit logon event that you would expect to see when someone logs onto a remote Windows system. So the security log would typically record that. In this instance, because of the way the attack worked, it didn't. So that made tracking lateral movement much more difficult. So we could tell where an attacker came from. We were never able to tell where they were going to from a given system. So to respond to this, we basically had to work around these Kerberos attacks at the outset. So we swept for that, invoked Mimikatz, passed the ticket usage like you just saw, and that allowed us to identify pivot systems and at least know kind of where they were pivoting from. We swept for other indicators of lateral movement. We had pretty good indicators for their scheduled tasks and for a lot of the other things that they were doing. And that allowed us to identify those destination systems. And then basically when we would go on to analyze them, we would look for those Kerberos logons around the time of the attacker activity. Thankfully, towards the end of the investigation, Sean Metcalf over at adsecurity.org was doing some really good research about these ticket attacks and kind of what the forensic evidence that was left behind. So we were able to use some of that research to develop some indicators that we could use to sweep at scale. We weren't really able to use these to great effect in the investigation just because it was so late, but we've been able to bring those into future investigations, and they have really been crucial. They are extremely high fidelity and very useful. And for a couple of examples of things that you might look for that, in Windows 7, the 4624 logon event, if the FQDN occurs in the account domain, that's probably malicious. I think there's some edge case about like cross-domain logons or something where that happens, but it's not typically going to be there. Also in the privileged logon and the logoff events, the empty account domain, there's really no use case in which you should have an empty account domain on like an enterprise Windows domain. Now, I know that the Mimikatz authors have gone through and patched some of these things. I know that they definitely patched the FQDN, and also Windows changed the way that they record logon events in Windows 10, so that FQDN will false positive on every Windows 10 system, so it's not quite as good as it used to be. But I haven't done research yet on whether they've patched the empty account domains, but as far as I know, those should still be good indicators. January 5th, all right. Well, it's dead, never mind. So kind of the key to this is use your attacker's strengths against them. Any of these like really interesting, high-tech attacks make for very good indicators. If things aren't being used legitimately, like WMI, when we look for WMI persistence, there's only one false positive I've ever seen, and it's this Dell tool for like stolen laptops or something. It's very easy to filter out these false positives when really nobody else is using it. And you can kind of walk through the typical indicator development cycle there, like identify the activity, develop your indicators, increase your visibility at scale. This is key, especially for things like PowerShell. I can't recommend enough that every organization needs to have PowerShell logging enabled in their environment. This is something I've been preaching a lot. Automate the detection wherever possible, and if you can create an alerting system, all the better, because that will really help you stay on top of your attackers. If you've learned nothing else from this, the kind of key takeaway is that you have to meet or exceed your attacker's pace, their visibility, their development cycle, and their advanced techniques. So you really just have to match their intensity, because the attacker always has the advantage, so you have to be willing to do whatever it takes to keep up with them in order to ultimately be successful. And with that, we'll take questions. Yep.
Question and comment. Comment first. Just one of the things you're going to talk to your ops group about turning on PowerShell logging. You're going to have a layout of what advantages it gives you, what it gives them, because it is going to create a full load of logs, and they don't want to add that many logs and that stress to their environment, on their systems, and on your workstations. So you're going to face that opposition right off the bat. I run into it, I had to back burner it, I'll go back to it later. But just FYI, that's something security people always think, turn on logs, and ops people going, no, it's going to crash my server, which it may, because it's a full load. All right.
It is.
Can you repeat that, and I'll go to my question.
So he was just saying that with PowerShell logs, you'll probably get some amount of pushback on that just because it does create a lot of logging. With PowerShell 5, there's actually some flexibility there. So you have like script block logging. It will actually record every block of script that comes in, which is great because it'll actually de-obfuscate everything for you. So even if they do have things like all obfuscated up, during those logs, it will get ultimately back to plain text, and so you can write indicators against that. There's a lot of different things there, so there's some nuance to that. We're going to try to get some guidance out from Mandiant as far as like what we recommend for PowerShell logs. It does create module logging does create a lot of logs. It can create up to a megabyte a minute of logs during normal attacker activity, but that's a matter of even if you're not integrating that into your SIM, which I would definitely not recommend anyone integrate that into their SIM. At least having it on the endpoint provides a data resource that if you have endpoint visibility, and if you don't have endpoint visibility, we'll bring it to you. That way, at least the data is there for you to use, and it's kind of a good preparation for an incident.
The other thing was that you said at the beginning that you don't normally leverage the
Client personnel, yeah.
Into your investigation. Philosophical question: if you're not bringing them into it, is that beneficial to them learning how to do things better on their own? Or do you think that would be something that I'm not saying, you know,
Yeah,
you guys be experts there.
he was asking about the early comment about we don't typically involve the client team. So that's not entirely true, just not normally to this scale. So as a learning opportunity, always we're very hands-on. We'll work with the team, show them everything that we're doing when we can. What we're really referring to there is typically when we say you own these 5 systems of the 10 that have been compromised this day, I mean, it's pretty unheard of for us to not have actually done it. There's legal ramifications for that if we're the hired incident response company, and there's some challenges there. But this meant fully kind of outsourcing because we had changed the reporting model. It allowed it to those little triage text blocks, whereas normally there's a kind of a forensic report and some requirements on reporting. It's more about how we expect it to come back. But we're really big on involving people, and that's a great qualification. It's not as if we come in blind to the security team, do a bunch of things, pack up and leave, and we try to make sure everyone gets something from it. It's a great comment. Yeah, we can. So the question is about the preventative landscape, things that the client wasn't doing that they were doing later. That actually has the amount of mitigative steps needed were definitely a big part of the timeline, right? And we had to make sure we stayed on them all the way up till when we were ready to do the proper remediation, which is why we couldn't lose track. But I do want to say, you were saying the things the client wasn't doing. Something we forgot to say. This particular client team, this was kind of one of the best in the industry. They're a very good team. So there wasn't as if there was any negligence, a lot not being done. I don't know if you have any particular additional things that they really rolled out. Yeah, I mean, just really properly scoping it and doing everything at the right time in order to do things like the Kerberos ticket granting ticket double reset, like across all the domain controllers. Making sure that's completely useless if you're not properly scoped and the attacker's still there, and then we'll grab it and continue. But we can talk about maybe some of the things they did offline.
Yep.
What facility from deploying your own tools, and if we're not Mandiant and have our own awesome, self-created tools that what are all open source alternatives for smaller teams without massive budgets?
Grab that one.
Yeah, sure. So the question was when we said we weren't used to, we weren't able to deploy our own tools. So this is actually fairly common. So I'm not going to say we had amazing indicators and this would have all been great, we would have moved quickly. This is fairly typical. There's costs associated with everything. One of the things I really like about our job is we respond and we prefer our tools. As you saw when we talk about like Mir, I really don't want to talk about like vendor specific things, but because we all use it, we came up with scripts and ways enterprise-wide to parse WMI and look for those things. But it's very common for us to just use whatever's out there. Again, it's part of what I like. So we've responded to this same group in places that have, Carbon Black, that have different tools, and we'll just hop on and use those. In this case, I mentioned Splunk and Bro. Those aren't something we typically use. So we try to be pretty creative. So there's just different clients have different requirements on why you can and can't use different things. Some of our things use off-site processing. Some people prefer to have it on-premise. It depends on the particular tool set, but there was just some policy limitations there. That makes sense. And they actually had, like I said, a lot of tools already. Yeah, so we haven't, so our particular talk, we're really trying to avoid obviously talking about the client and the particular group. It's really interesting. We know a lot about the group. We've put out a lot about, we've put out some things about this group. So we've put out malware family profiles and indicators and things like that. So for most of those backdoor families, I think that we described, maybe about half of them. But there's not a particular comprehensive research that's breach specific, but we have put out a lot of stuff about this group.
Yeah.
Would you say that what you saw in this breach is a change from previous behavior from that group?
So, I've actually been working this group almost nonstop for the last year, and in most of those intrusions, they were not nearly this persistent. So it does seem like they were doing some things a little bit differently, probably based on just their targeting priority. I think that this particular client was such a high priority for them that they were willing to burn like the resources to do this. I mean, if you think about burning, close to 1,000 compromised legitimate websites, I mean, that's a lot of logistics that you're dumping into this investigation you're never going to be able to use again. Not really, sorry.
But
They initially recognized they were compromised.
the initial.
Yeah, the initial.
Again, we're really trying to avoid like vendor specific things. They actually had one of our products on the network side. So the reason we got told about it is we got told about that. We got some phone calls. Hey, we're seeing beaconing from this backdoor family, and some people got really excited. We're like, we like that backdoor family. We tried to give them some info, and they said, we're seeing beaconing from this other backdoor family. We're like, we also like that one. You might be in some trouble, and that's when they contained it, made the containment attempt on their own. That didn't work, and then I think we were on site, 2 or 3 days after that. So the initial detection was based on signatures from like a FireEye network device.
Could you say the conclusion? Were you successful or are they totally out?
Oh, I guess we should have. You never really know with these guys, so I'm hesitant to say that. But yeah, we have no indication that they are still there. Through the comprehensive, there was another channel, right? The whole group of people that were attempting we were informing the remediation team, but there's a whole other team tackling that. And they did a bunch of comprehensive changes. And kind of the combination of all those, scoping it well, led to success.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well that with the first failed remediation attempt, like they just came back and just started deploying en masse. Like they didn't try to go stealthy. They didn't try to like hide. They just like full onslaught. And I think that if we had failed the second time, it probably would have been more of the same. It would have been back to business as usual.
The last backdoors within.
Yeah, so also kind of an interesting thing from an OPSEC perspective. They did actually deploy a new backdoor family 3 hours before our remediation started. So yeah, I mean, they were definitely on top of it and doing some interesting things there.
But luckily we had them scoped, so we were able to stop that. So we think that's a further indication that they weren't successful.
Yeah.
We just got the stop sign, but we'll be...
Yeah, we'll be here. And also hit us up on Twitter if you want to follow up. We'd be happy to talk with anyone.
And just a reminder to everybody, we are here filming all 3 tracks, and so we will have DVDs of this presentation out on our table in about 20 or 30 minutes. They're $10. Thank you.